The fastest way to reveal someone's character is to give them a little authority and a stranger to judge. The words would not mean much to anyone standing inside First Federal Bank that Tuesday morning, but before the day was over, nearly everyone in the lobby would remember them. Danielle Carter stepped through the glass doors carrying a worn brown leather tote and a folded withdrawal slip. She looked more like someone coming from a long day of work than someone about to request $50,000 in cash. Her dark gray jacket showed a few wrinkles. The sleeves were lightly dusted from a warehouse inspection earlier that morning. Comfortable work boots replaced the expensive heels many people expected to see in a financial district. The lobby itself was bright and modern. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting across polished marble floors. Customers waited in line while quiet instrumental music played through hidden speakers overhead. A television mounted near the entrance displayed financial news no one seemed to be watching. Danielle joined the line and waited patiently. She checked her phone once, responded to a brief email, and slipped it back into her tote. Nothing about her behavior suggested urgency. Nothing about her appearance attracted attention, at least not at first. When her turn arrived, she stepped forward and approached the counter. Behind it stood Brandon Hayes, a 31-year-old teller who had worked at the branch for nearly 6 years. Brandon considered himself an expert at reading people. He often believed he could tell a customer's financial status before opening an account profile. Sometimes he was right. Sometimes he was not. Unfortunately, he rarely questioned his own assumptions. Danielle offered a polite smile and slid the withdrawal form across the counter. "Good morning," she said. "I would like to make a withdrawal." Brandon glanced at the form. His expression remained neutral for less than a second. Then his eyebrows lifted. $50,000. He looked back at Danielle, then down at the form, then back at Danielle again. The line behind her grew slightly longer. A woman holding a coffee cup shifted her weight. An older gentleman adjusted his glasses. Brandon leaned back in his chair. $50,000, he asked. "Yes," Danielle replied calmly. "That is correct." Brandon studied her for another moment. His eyes moved from her work boots to her jacket and finally to the leather tote resting beside her. Then came the comment that immediately changed the atmosphere around the counter. "People do not usually withdraw $50,000 dressed like that." The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. Several nearby customers heard them clearly. A few heads turned. The woman with the coffee lowered her cup. Danielle remained completely still. Her expression did not change. Brandon seemed almost surprised by her composure. Most people would have become defensive. Most people would have challenged him immediately. Instead, Danielle simply folded her hands together on the counter and asked a question. "Did you check the account?" Brandon looked at the computer screen for a brief moment. Then he looked back at her, but he never answered the question. And that was the first mistake that would change everything before the day was over. Brandon tapped a few keys on his keyboard, but his attention seemed focused less on the account and more on the woman standing in front of him. The computer monitor cast a pale blue glow across his face as he pretended to review information. Danielle waited quietly. She had spent enough years in business to recognize the difference between someone doing their job and someone making up their mind before seeing the facts. Around them, the lobby continued its normal rhythm. Phones rang softly behind the customer service desks. A printer hummed somewhere in the back office. Customers moved through the line one by one. Yet an unusual tension lingered around the counter. Several people were still listening. Brandon leaned forward slightly. "That is a significant amount of cash," he said. "What exactly do you need it for?" Danielle noticed the question immediately. Not because it was unusual, but because of the way he asked it. The tone suggested suspicion rather than procedure. "A business transaction," she replied. Brandon nodded slowly. "What kind of business?" Danielle offered a polite smile. "A legal one." A faint laugh escaped from a customer standing several feet away. Brandon did not smile. He seemed irritated by her calmness. "You understand we have to be careful." Danielle nodded. "I agree." Brandon waited for more explanation. None came. For several seconds, they simply looked at one another. Then Danielle asked the same question again. "Did you check the account?" Brandon shifted in his chair. "I am reviewing everything." But Danielle noticed the account summary window on his screen had not even been opened. He had not reviewed anything important yet. He was still operating on assumptions. Behind Brandon, a framed display hung on the wall featuring several corporate partners recognized by the bank. Large company logos filled the display beneath a heading that read Valued Business Relationships. Danielle's eyes briefly moved toward it before returning to the conversation. Brandon followed her glance, but did not think much of it. "You may need managerial approval," he said, "for a withdrawal this size." Danielle nodded. "Then let us request it." Brandon seemed surprised by the answer. He had expected resistance. Instead, she remained cooperative. That only frustrated him more. He stood and disappeared through a doorway leading toward the branch offices. Danielle remained at the counter. The woman with the coffee quietly stepped closer. "Are you okay?" she asked. Danielle smiled warmly. "I am fine." The woman nodded and returned to her place in line. A few minutes later, Brandon returned accompanied by branch manager Margaret Sullivan. Margaret appeared professional and composed, though slightly concerned by the unusual situation. She greeted Danielle politely. "Good morning, ma'am. I understand there is a withdrawal request." Danielle handed her identification and the completed paperwork. Margaret accepted both and reviewed them carefully. Unlike Brandon, she immediately focused on documentation rather than appearance. For a moment, Danielle thought the issue might finally be resolved. Then Brandon spoke before Margaret could finish reviewing the information. "I told her we need to be careful." Margaret looked at him, then back at the documents, then toward the computer screen. Something about her expression changed slightly. Not alarm, not concern, curiosity. She glanced at Danielle again. Danielle simply stood there waiting. Calm, patient, certain. And for the first time that morning, Margaret began to wonder whether the account itself might tell a very different story than the one Brandon had already decided to believe. Margaret Sullivan studied the account information on the screen longer than Brandon expected. Her eyes moved carefully across the transaction history, account details, and authorization records. The longer she looked, the quieter she became. Brandon noticed it immediately. So did Danielle. The customers nearby could not see the screen, but they could sense a shift in the atmosphere. Something had changed. Margaret clicked through several pages without saying a word. Finally, Brandon leaned closer. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Margaret did not answer right away. Instead, she reviewed another page and adjusted her glasses. Danielle remained calm. She had no interest in embarrassing anyone. She simply wanted to complete a legitimate transaction and continue with her day. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, afternoon sunlight reflected off nearby office buildings. Cars moved steadily through the intersection. Inside the bank, however, time seemed to slow. Margaret looked at Danielle. "You said this withdrawal is for a business transaction?" Danielle nodded. "Yes. Today. Within the next 2 hours." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. Brandon folded his arms. He still appeared convinced that caution was justified. In his mind, nothing about Danielle matched the image he associated with someone managing large amounts of money. That belief had already shaped every decision he made. What he did not realize was that Danielle had spent most of the morning walking through one of her company's regional distribution centers. The warehouse sat nearly 30 miles outside the city. She had arrived before sunrise to review operations personally. While many executives preferred conference rooms and quarterly presentations, Danielle believed leadership required visibility. She liked seeing the work firsthand. She liked talking to employees on loading docks and warehouse floors. She liked understanding problems before they reached executive reports. That habit was one reason her company had grown so rapidly over the past decade. Yet none of that showed in the way she dressed. None of it appeared in the dust on her jacket sleeve or the practical boots she still wore. To Brandon, she simply looked ordinary. Margaret returned her attention to the monitor. Then she noticed something mounted on the wall behind the customer waiting area. It was the same corporate recognition display Danielle had glanced at earlier. Several logos appeared beneath the heading celebrating strategic business partners. One particular logo stood near the center. Large, familiar, respected throughout the region. Margaret's eyes moved from the display back to the account information, then back to the display again. A small crease formed between her eyebrows. She seemed to be connecting pieces of information she had not previously considered. Brandon noticed her expression. "What is it?" he asked. Margaret hesitated. "Nothing yet." Yet her tone suggested otherwise. Danielle quietly followed Margaret's gaze toward the wall display. For a brief moment their eyes met. Neither woman said anything. Neither needed to. Then Margaret returned to the computer and opened another page. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly. It lasted less than a second. Most people would have missed it. Danielle did not. Brandon certainly did, but he interpreted it completely wrong. He assumed the reaction confirmed his suspicions. In reality, Margaret had just discovered something that made her question every assumption that had been made since Danielle walked through the front doors. And the more she reviewed the account, the more impossible it became to ignore. Brandon misread the situation completely. Standing beside Margaret's desk, he interpreted her silence as confirmation that something was wrong with the account. The possibility that he might be mistaken never seemed to cross his mind. He straightened his tie and glanced toward Danielle with a look that suggested he expected the conversation to end in his favor. Margaret, meanwhile, continued reviewing information on the screen. The account history was extensive. The balances were substantial. The authorization levels were unusually high. More importantly, every document appeared perfectly valid. She clicked through another page, then another. The deeper she looked, the more questions she had about why this transaction had become an issue at all. Danielle waited patiently at the counter. She checked the time on her phone. The contractor she was scheduled to meet later that afternoon would be expecting payment within a few hours. Delays were inconvenient, but not disastrous. What interested her more was how quickly assumptions could influence decisions. It was a lesson she had learned many years earlier when she started her company with a single leased truck and a small warehouse. Back then, banks had often questioned her business plans. Investors had doubted her projections. Competitors had dismissed her. None of that bothered her anymore. Success had taught her something valuable. People often reveal more about themselves than they realize. Across the lobby, customers continued to watch discreetly. Some pretended to read brochures. Others checked their phones. Yet many remained curious about the unusual delay. Brandon finally broke the silence. Perhaps we should request additional verification. Margaret looked up. Additional verification for what? The question caught him off guard. For the withdrawal. Margaret folded her hands. The account has sufficient funds. Brandon hesitated. Still, it is a large amount. It is. Margaret agreed. Which is why procedures exist. For a brief moment, Brandon appeared relieved. Then Margaret continued. Procedures that should be followed before assumptions are made. The words landed harder than he expected. Danielle remained silent. She had no desire to turn the moment into an argument. Margaret returned her attention to the screen. Then her eyes moved once more toward the corporate recognition display on the wall. The same logo stood prominently among the bank's most valued business relationships. A logistics company known throughout several states. A company responsible for millions of dollars in annual transactions. A company that happened to match information appearing repeatedly throughout the account records she was reviewing. Margaret looked back at Danielle. May I ask something? She said politely. Of course, Danielle replied. Do you still actively visit your facilities? Danielle smiled slightly. It was the first personal question anyone had asked all morning. Every week, she said. Brandon frowned. The question seemed completely unrelated to him. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. I thought so. Danielle noticed something changing in her demeanor. The manager was no longer investigating a problem. She was trying to confirm a suspicion. Before either woman could continue, Danielle's phone vibrated softly on the counter. A call was coming in. She glanced at the screen and immediately recognized the name. Her expression did not change, but she answered without hesitation. Hello. The voice on the other end spoke for only a few seconds. Danielle listened quietly. Then she smiled. That timing is perfect, she said. Margaret watched carefully. Brandon did not understand why. But within the next few minutes, the call Danielle had just received would begin revealing a truth that no one inside the branch was prepared to hear. The call lasted less than 30 seconds, yet something about it immediately changed the atmosphere around Danielle. She listened quietly, nodded once, and thanked the caller before ending the conversation. Then she slipped the phone back into her tote, as though nothing important had happened. Margaret noticed the calm confidence in her expression. Brandon noticed it too, although he interpreted it very differently. To him, confidence without visible proof seemed suspicious. To Margaret, it suggested certainty. The difference between those two perspectives was becoming more obvious with every passing minute. The lobby had grown quieter. Several customers who had originally intended to finish their transactions and leave were still lingering nearby. They sensed a story unfolding, even if they did not yet understand it. Danielle glanced toward the large recognition display on the wall again. Sunlight reflected softly across the polished frame surrounding the corporate logos. One logo in particular stood only a few feet away, yet no one except Margaret seemed to be paying attention to it. Brandon cleared his throat. If this is going to take much longer, perhaps we should postpone the withdrawal until tomorrow. Danielle looked at him calmly. Why would we do that? Brandon hesitated. Additional review. Margaret immediately turned toward him. Additional review of what? For the second time that morning, Brandon did not have a clear answer. The account had already been verified. The identification matched. The documentation was complete. Yet he continued searching for reasons to justify a decision he had made before looking at any facts. Danielle did not argue. She simply waited. Outside, a delivery truck rolled past the bank. The afternoon sun climbed higher above the buildings downtown. Time continued moving forward. Inside the branch, however, everyone seemed stuck in the same moment. Then Danielle's phone vibrated again. This time it was not a call. It was a message. She glanced at the screen and smiled faintly. Margaret noticed. Good news? She asked. Danielle nodded. Someone is already on their way. Brandon folded his arms. Who? Danielle looked at him politely. A colleague. The answer seemed simple enough, but something about it unsettled him. Margaret returned to the account records one more time. As she reviewed the business relationship section, her eyes widened slightly. There it was again. The same company name. The same corporate identifier. The same logo hanging on the wall. This was no ordinary account. She opened another internal page. Then another. The information became impossible to ignore. A small breath escaped her lips before she could stop it. Danielle heard it. Brandon did not. He was too focused on proving himself right. Several minutes later, the front doors opened. A sharply dressed man carrying a tablet computer stepped into the lobby. He looked around briefly before his eyes landed on Danielle. His expression immediately brightened. Without hesitation, he walked directly toward her. The confidence in his stride suggested familiarity, respect, and urgency all at once. Danielle stood to greet him. The man smiled. Sorry I am late, he said. The board meeting ran longer than expected. Margaret stared. Brandon blinked in confusion. Because the moment the man arrived, it became clear that whatever story Brandon thought he understood was about to change completely. The man set his tablet on the counter and extended his hand toward Danielle with the ease of someone who had worked beside her for years. Good afternoon, he said. I brought the updated numbers you requested. Danielle smiled warmly. Thank you, Michael. Brandon watched the exchange carefully. The confidence between them was impossible to miss. This was not a customer asking a friend for help. This was a professional relationship built on trust. Margaret stepped slightly closer. May I ask who you are? She said. The man turned politely. Michael Reynolds, Chief Financial Officer. Brandon frowned. The title sounded important, but he still did not understand why. Michael glanced at Danielle. Would you like me to explain the situation? Danielle shook her head gently. Not yet. Her answer only deepened the mystery. The lobby had become remarkably quiet. Even customers waiting in line seemed reluctant to leave. Something significant was clearly unfolding. Michael picked up the tablet and opened a video conference application. Several names appeared on the screen. Financial reports, charts, and meeting notes filled the display. Danielle reviewed a few items while standing at the counter. To anyone paying attention, the conversation sounded less like a bank transaction and more like an executive briefing. The acquisition documents are ready, Michael said. The contractor confirmed delivery schedules. We only need final authorization. Danielle nodded. Excellent. Margaret listened carefully. Every sentence raised new questions. Brandon crossed his arms. He still appeared skeptical, though uncertainty had begun creeping into his expression. Danielle reviewed another document. Did the board approve the expansion? She asked. Unanimously, Michael replied. This morning. Danielle smiled. Good. Then she signed an electronic document directly on the tablet. Michael immediately uploaded it. The entire exchange took less than 30 seconds. Yet it carried the rhythm of decisions involving millions of dollars. Margaret noticed it. So did several customers. Brandon did not know what to think anymore. The story he had constructed in his mind was becoming harder and harder to defend. Michael turned the tablet slightly toward Danielle. A corporate dashboard filled the screen. Revenue forecasts, distribution maps, facility reports. Every page displayed the same company logo hanging on the recognition wall behind them. Margaret felt a chill run through her. She knew that logo. Every branch manager in the region knew that logo. The company was one of the bank's largest business partners. Annual transactions reached extraordinary levels. Entire banking teams were assigned to support the relationship. Michael looked at Danielle. One more thing. The board wants your approval before the announcement goes public. Danielle nodded. Send it to my office. Then Michael paused. Should I update your title on the release? Brandon glanced up. Title. Michael looked surprised by the question. Yes. He turned the tablet toward Danielle. A draft press release appeared on the screen. At the top, directly beneath the company logo, were words that instantly changed the atmosphere inside the bank. Margaret saw them first. Her eyes widened. Several seconds passed before she spoke. Brandon followed her gaze. Then he saw them too. Founder and Chief Executive Officer. For a moment, nobody said a word. The screen remained visible. The title remained impossible to ignore. And suddenly, every assumption that had guided the day began collapsing under the weight of a simple truth that had been standing in front of them all along. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The soft music playing through the bank's ceiling speakers suddenly felt distant. The customers who had remained nearby exchanged surprised glances. Even those who did not fully understand what they were seeing understood one thing immediately. Danielle Carter was not who Brandon Hayes had assumed she was. Margaret slowly looked from the tablet screen back to Danielle. Then she looked at the corporate recognition display on the wall. The same logo appeared in both places. The connection was now impossible to miss. Michael Reynolds closed the tablet and rested it against his side. He seemed unaware of the shock spreading through the lobby because, to him, there was nothing unusual about the situation. This was simply another workday, another meeting, another business decision. Brandon swallowed hard. The confidence that had carried him through the morning had completely disappeared. He looked at Danielle as if seeing her for the first time. You are the CEO? He asked quietly. Danielle offered a polite smile. That is one of my responsibilities. The answer somehow made the moment even more uncomfortable. There was no arrogance in her voice. No attempt to embarrass him. Just a simple statement of fact. Margaret immediately turned back toward the computer terminal. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. She opened internal relationship records, corporate account summaries, and partnership profiles. What she found made her sit back in disbelief. The numbers were far beyond what she had originally imagined. Company deposits, investment accounts, operating reserves, regional transaction activity. The relationship between the bank and Danielle's company stretched back years. It represented one of the most significant business partnerships in the entire region. Margaret looked up slowly. Brandon, she said carefully. Do you realize whose account you questioned? Brandon did not answer. He could not. Margaret turned the monitor slightly toward him. His eyes moved across the screen. The color drained from his face. Every page confirmed the same reality. The withdrawal request that had started the entire situation represented a tiny fraction of the company's financial activity. The amount he had treated as suspicious barely registered against the account history. Around them, the atmosphere continued shifting. Employees who had quietly observed the situation now understood what had happened. Several looked uncomfortable. Others looked disappointed. Not because Danielle was successful, but because the facts had been available from the very beginning. All anyone needed to do was check. Michael glanced at his watch. We should probably leave soon, he said. The contractor meeting starts in less than 90 minutes. Danielle nodded. You are right. Then she looked toward Margaret. I still need the withdrawal completed. Margaret stood immediately. Of course. There was no hesitation in her voice now. None at all. But before she could walk away, Danielle spoke again. For the record, this was never about the money. The room became quiet once more. Brandon slowly lifted his eyes. Danielle looked directly at him, not with anger, but with a calm honesty that somehow carried more weight than any accusation could. The account never changed today, she said softly. Only the assumptions did. And as those words settled across the lobby, everyone present understood that the biggest revelation had nothing to do with a bank balance, a company title, or a business account. It was about how quickly people decide who someone is before they ever learn the truth. For a few moments, nobody spoke. The lesson hanging in the air seemed far larger than the transaction that had brought everyone together. Margaret took a slow breath and stepped away to complete the withdrawal request personally. There would be no further delays. There would be no additional questions. The procedures that should have been followed from the beginning were finally being followed now. Danielle remained standing near the counter while Michael reviewed a few notes on his tablet. The customers who had witnessed the entire situation gradually returned to their own business, but many continued glancing back. Some looked thoughtful. Others looked embarrassed on behalf of the bank. Brandon stood quietly behind his station. The certainty that had guided him all morning was gone. In its place was the uncomfortable realization that every important fact had been available from the start. He simply had not looked for it. Several minutes later, Margaret returned carrying the completed paperwork. "Everything is ready," she said. Then she paused. "Mrs. Carter, I owe you an apology." Danielle looked at her calmly. Margaret continued. "This should have been handled professionally from the beginning." It was not. The sincerity in her voice was impossible to miss. Danielle nodded politely. "Thank you." Margaret glanced briefly toward Brandon before looking back at Danielle. "We will be reviewing what happened today." Danielle understood what she meant. Internal discussions, training reviews, difficult conversations, the normal consequences of a mistake that should never have happened. Yet none of that seemed important to her anymore. Michael closed his tablet. "The contractor meeting will be easy after this," he said with a small smile. Danielle laughed softly. It was the first relaxed moment she had experienced all day. Then an unexpected voice broke the silence. "Mrs. Carter?" Brandon's words were hesitant. Danielle turned toward him. The entire lobby seemed to pause again. Brandon looked down briefly before meeting her eyes. "I should have checked the account first." Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. He continued. "I made assumptions that I should not have made." The admission was simple, but it was honest. Danielle studied him for a moment. She saw embarrassment, regret. A man forced to confront a version of himself he probably did not like very much. "Then learn from it," she said gently. "That is more valuable than pretending it never happened." Brandon nodded slowly. There was nothing else to say. No dramatic confrontation. No humiliation. No victory speech. Just the truth. The afternoon sunlight continued pouring through the windows, casting long reflections across the marble floor. Outside, the city moved through another ordinary day. Inside the bank, however, something had changed. Not because a customer turned out to be successful. Not because of a title or a balance sheet. Something changed because assumptions had been exposed before they could hide behind procedure. Margaret handed Danielle the final documents. Michael gathered his tablet. The transaction was complete. But the real lesson had never been about $50,000. It had always been about what happens when people decide who someone is before they take the time to find out. 3 weeks later, the afternoon sun hung low over the city as Danielle Carter stepped out of a black SUV and looked up at a newly completed distribution facility on the edge of town. The building stretched across several acres, its glass entrance reflecting shades of gold and amber from the autumn sky. Employees moved through the parking lot at the end of their shifts, exchanging greetings and laughter before heading home. It had been a busy month. Contracts had been signed. Expansion plans had moved forward. New jobs had been created. Life, as always, continued. Danielle walked through the front entrance and paused beside a display wall near the lobby. Photographs showed the company's journey from a single leased warehouse to a nationally recognized logistics operation. Some pictures were decades old. Others had been taken only weeks earlier. None of them showed the challenges hidden behind the success. None showed the people who had underestimated her along the way. But perhaps that was the point. The most important victories rarely appeared in photographs. They lived inside the lessons people carried forward. Her phone vibrated softly. A message appeared from Michael Reynolds. The contractor project had been completed ahead of schedule. Danielle smiled and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Across the lobby, several employees waved as they passed. She greeted each one by name. It was something she had always done. Titles mattered in boardrooms. Respect mattered everywhere. Later that evening, as the building grew quieter, Danielle stood alone beside the large windows overlooking the loading yards. Long rows of lights illuminated the facility against the darkening sky. Trucks moved steadily in the distance. The operation continued exactly as planned. Yet her thoughts drifted back to that day at the bank. Not because of the withdrawal, not because of the misunderstanding, and certainly not because of the title that had surprised everyone. What stayed with her was something simpler. A reminder that assumptions often reveal more about the person making them than the person receiving them. She remembered Brandon's expression when he finally understood. She remembered Margaret's willingness to acknowledge what had happened. Most of all, she remembered choosing not to respond with anger. Some lessons are taught through consequences. Others are taught through grace. A few days earlier, Margaret had sent a letter. The bank had implemented additional training and revised several customer service procedures. Brandon had written a brief note as well. It was not dramatic. It was not perfect, but it was sincere. Danielle appreciated that. Growth rarely begins with certainty. It begins with honesty. Outside, a cool breeze moved across the property. The last colors of sunset faded beyond the horizon. Danielle gathered her things and headed toward the exit. As she stepped outside, she glanced back once at the building behind her. Thousands of people would pass through its doors in the years ahead. Most would never know her story. They would not know how many times she had been underestimated before succeeding. They would not know how often assumptions had stood in the way of opportunity. And that was fine. The lesson was never about proving people wrong. It was about refusing to let their assumptions decide who you are. With that thought, Danielle walked toward the parking lot beneath the evening sky. The lights of the city shimmered in the distance. The future waited ahead. And somewhere in the quiet rhythm of an ordinary night, dignity had won exactly the way it always does, without needing to announce itself.